Hey everyone, I'm Abbey Fernández here with Scott Budman, our business and tech reporter, who's been covering everything related to Theranos for a long time, including Elizabeth Holmes' trial and most recently Sunny Balwani's trial. Sunny is the former COO of the company and ex-boyfriend of Holmes. And the verdict was just announced recently. But Scott, before we get into that, why don't you give us a quick recap of Balwani's involvement with Theranos and why he was on trial in the first place?
So sure, Balwani was the chief operating officer and president of Theranos, which was run and founded by Elizabeth Holmes. Started when she was 19 and he was already pretty deeply into his 30s. They got involved in a relationship and they kept that relationship going while both working at Theranos. For a long time, it was secret. He was sort of the money person. He invested a lot of money because he'd had some tech success earlier, and then was the chief operating officer, which, as we know from people like Sheryl Sandberg, is a very, very important, powerful position in Silicon Valley. He was, just like her, on trial for counts of investor and patient fraud. They had broken up. They were at loggerheads. The judge decided to have two separate trials. That's why earlier this year, we had Elizabeth Holmes, 4 counts, found guilty of investor fraud, and then months later, we finally got the verdict on, in a different trial, Sunny Balwani.
Now, were these counts the same for Holmes and Balwani?
Yes.
They were,
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was the same trial put forward pretty much to the witness by the prosecution, but they ended up going in very different directions with much different results.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into those results right now because the verdict came in just a few days ago. And you were there in the courtroom throughout this entire trial. And I want to ask you, they found him guilty on all 12 charges, like you said. What was it like in there, and how was he reacting and his team reacting when those charges were being read?
It was the kind of thing where there were a whole lot of people in there, and I've only covered 2 or 3 trials in my entire career. And just like Holmes, the oxygen was sucked out of the room as the guilty verdicts were read. Unlike Holmes, it was 12 in a row. Guilty, 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 guilty. Balwani was silent, looking straight ahead. Obviously, his defense team had failed completely, trying to get him off the hook. And instantly, people were comparing the two.
Yeah.
Okay, so Holmes found guilty on 4 counts of investor fraud, but not patient fraud. In other words, they assumed that she was not running the lab, but Balwani was running the lab and therefore in charge of the failed Theranos blood testing machines, while also sharing responsibility for conspiracy to commit fraud against the high-dollar investors. They got him on everything while only getting her on raising money fraudulently.
So according to this jury, Balwani was behind everything. He was the mastermind then.
Yeah, and actually you can go back to the Holmes trial where she portrayed him as something of a Svengali, the much older man who was not only in charge, but according to her testimony, physically and mentally abusive. And even though he didn't testify, neither did she in his trial, you could see and feel that cloud hanging over him. There were Theranos employees that came forward in his trial to say, I'm going to point the finger at you as an abusive boss. And that seemed to stick. And by not bringing him onto the stand, as they did with Holmes, he really didn't defend himself at all.
Now, Scott, though, going into this, I mean, following Holmes's trial and the verdict and going into his trial, did we think he was going to be found guilty on all counts? Was this the expectation?
I mean, the expectation for most people were that he would be found guilty on at least some of the counts, because even in Holmes's trial, they had pretty much established that they worked together. They were a team. Yeah. But if they were a team, might they be found not guilty on the same charges? No, it turns out not only did they link Balwani to those fraudulent investor calls, they linked him to the machines and the lab. And that was the dagger for the 12 ultimate charges against him.
Wow. Okay, so his sentencing has been set for November 15th.
Right.
As you and I mentioned before we started here, Elizabeth Holmes's sentencing date was changed, so this could possibly happen with Balwani's as well.
You never really know, but right, she's scheduled for now for late September, he in November. And again, people will be comparing the two every step of the way, but they face up to 20 years in prison. And again, I have no idea how these things work in terms of each charge, but there's enough, I'm told, to sentence them for quite a bit of time, and that's what Silicon Valley is watching. The venture capitalists are worried, the founders are worried. How much can they exaggerate about what they're doing to their investors and even customers if these guys are going to jail for a long time?
I mean, I get why they're worried, but what would be the impact then if they do get a lot of time?
I think sort of a chilling effect on venture capitalists and founders looking to raise money from investors by exaggerating what their product can do and when it's going to be ready. Because remember, Holmes not only told their investors, hey, we're selling these things to the military and all these places where they weren't, but also the capabilities. She was lying about that too, and they linked Balwani to that. And so it could have a chilling effect on sort of the PR factor when you're trying to raise money.
Now, do you think that the strategy of these Silicon Valley people out here trying to make some money for their companies is going to change regardless of?
Yes, because I've been talking to them about it. And
what are they saying, Scott?
They're saying that they're a little worried about this, whether it's on Sand Hill Road among the venture capital community or founders saying they're watching this closely because there have been slaps on the wrist if you lie to investors or exaggerate what you're going to do, famously here in Silicon Valley. But it's been done. But if someone goes to jail for 10 to 20 years because of that, everyone takes a step back, and that's what they tell me they're watching is there going to be a significant prison time for this? And if so, we might have to dial things back a little bit.
That's very interesting. Well, you, as I mentioned earlier, you've been covering both trials. You did them for the extent of both of them, and you're really heavy on social. You tweet a lot, and you got a lot of attention with Elizabeth Holmes' trial. I mean, from start to finish. Not so much with Balwani, right?
Right. With Balwani, we'd show up to trial, and not only were there not a lot of journalists there were no spectators. Unlike Holmes, I didn't show up to see people dressing like the defendant and selling blonde wigs and turtlenecks. There was a little bit of a circus atmosphere among young people especially who were fascinated with Elizabeth Holmes and the whole girl boss thing. That lent itself to a huge online response. With Balwani, there was sort of a let's sit back and wait. And in court, tweeting out the guilty verdicts, everything went nuts on social. But I think it was just sort of pent-up demand. There just wasn't that much interest in him. And let's face it, he's an older guy. She is a young founder who dropped out of Stanford. It was a much more interesting story. There were documentaries and movies made about that. And with him, the social aspect just kind of waited until the end, I think.
Until the verdict was announced. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Talking about movies and shows, you and I have talked about this offline, the show The Dropout from Hulu. Did you get to watch it all?
I did, yes.
Okay. So now, having been there in the courtroom, Scott, after this trial, after the verdict, do you feel the show portrayed Sunny Balwani accurately?
To an extent. Now, when I covered Theranos, even before all this stuff, it was always Holmes as the front person. She was clearly the face of the company, and understandably so. I never interviewed Balwani before. None of us did. He really never spoke out. He was the guy in the back room, as it turns out, firing a lot of people. And so we didn't really know what he was like until the employees started to speak out, both in the documentary and in the book Bad Blood by John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal, and in the courtroom where we all heard. And everything said about him was negative, including by his former girlfriend who accuses him of abuse. And so he really doesn't have a good persona at all. But we didn't know that before because he was in the background and she was out front.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for your time and for breaking this all down for us. Always a pleasure.
Anytime.
All right. Thank you all for watching at home. We'll see you next time.